Hello, my name is Chase Bock, and this is my assessment on labor migration and gender in Chinese football manufacturing and the Chinese industry or industrial work as a whole. Starting out, we're going to be focusing on the football stitching industry, and to start, we're going to do some comparisons of work conditions between India, Pakistan, and China, just because by focusing on the same industry but then comparing it across global companies, it's a good comparison as to where China is at. So looking at this top table here, we can see Guangdong is a area in China, whereas these other two are from Pakistan and India respectively. So we can see that the second number, the median hourly wage, is much higher than India and Pakistan. However, it appears that the daily work hours are much higher on average, at least by a whole hour, 0.2. And then the weekly work days are like on the lower end of average, but are still pretty much the same. The good things to point out is there is no child labor, and good things, no child labor, and then there's some, at least, coverage of social insurance. However, there are no unionization or collective bargaining allowed, which is pretty across the board. So we go into this, well, why is China able to pay its factory workers on a much higher wage, and why are they able to afford things like social insurance and things like paying your people overtime? Well, if we look into figure 1, which is down here, we can see this is the exports of inflatable balls for China, Pakistan, Thailand, and India, with China being our top line here. And as you see, over the years, their exports are just getting larger and larger and larger, and so they are selling more and more soccer balls. This is allowing them to do factory and process upgrading, so they are able to make safer machines, more efficient machines. They're able to just pay them more in general. They're able to guarantee things like this. Now, with the same source, how does gender tie into all of this? While there are equal amounts of male and female in factories, we can see that this past table here, it only includes factory workers, whereas these other two include centers and homes. So in the paper, it says that there are centers and home-based stitching in China, but that the home-based stitching is comprised mostly of women in rural areas and rural populations that are just trying to get extra money. They noted that this is an area for exploitation, or I'm concluding that because there are some downsides, that it's less regulated by labor laws, so they're more at risk of occupational health and safety problems, having decreased wage, it's not a secure job, they can't guarantee insurance, things like that. And now going further into these work-related injuries, a majority of Chinese factory workers using stitching machines have reported occupational health and safety problems. You can read the list below. It's deformed fingertips, shoulder and elbow, arm and back pain. Just not things you want to be getting from a job, but they are. And then doing some research on the auto industry, they found some statistics on work-related musculoskeletal disorders, which relate to the OHS problems. And they found that in the auto industry, around 53.1% of Chinese workers in a 12-month period will report a work-related musculoskeletal disorder. And 36.5% of those are related to the lower waist and back, which they attribute to not having proper seating, not having proper breaks, if you're working on the floor, or if you're doing a lot of heavy lifting and not using proper lifting technique, things like those. And then they compiled a list of factors leading to high prevalence rates, being obesity, high education level, job tenure, so if you're there longer, being a female, And then logistics and foundry workers, which on average do a lot more heavy lifting and work with heavy materials. All right. And then we look at the migration. So where are these factory workers coming from? Are they coming from outside the country, within the country? Gained from the story of NPR, the reporter studied a group of factory workers within a 2-year span of them being there, and they found that working in factories is dominated by a group of rural and suburban peoples that are going to these factory cities for these jobs on purpose. And they've actually found that they don't get stuck in these jobs. There's a lot of social mobility. They're jumping from job to job, trying to get better pay. Maybe they're taking an English course and now they're able to be a secretary. That was one of the examples it brought up. Just things so that they can kind of climb that social ladder, make more, save more, and provide better for their families. So it's a very conscious decision, in my opinion, for these Chinese factory workers to be taking these jobs on. It's not like they're coerced or forced or have no other options. It's like a decision that they made to better themselves. And now, what do Chinese factory workers think as a whole about working in a factory overall? I have two juxtaposing sources. The one with NPR basically explains that they are choosing to do this while the living conditions and hours of suboptimal. I mean, you are working overtime a lot. You are working, it's said, on average 6 days of the week for soccer manufacturing. Living conditions, you are moving away from home, so you are oftentimes living in a dormitory that is on site of the factory, and so you're sharing a space with a lot of other workers. But the upsides are that the workers aren't confined or restricted to one product or one industry. So maybe one day you're working in fashion and the other day you're working in an auto factory. And they're also doing this as a part to plan for their futures. So as part of this collective decision to do this, they're trying to do this oftentimes so they can better provide for their families, so they can get a start in their careers, so they can save up money, so they can move back eventually at a higher status where they're able to own a home, own a car. And they did this because they were, for a temporary time, working in these factories to get themselves there. Juxtaposing to that is the PBS article. There are brands like Shine that are under criticism for poor working conditions and cheap textile labor. I did maybe a quick Google search about Shine criticism, and there are plenty of articles similarly about criticism because their workers are reporting labor abuse and a bunch of other stuff like that. So they actually brought the host of Inside the Shine Machine Untold, the podcast. They explain that there are 18-hour workdays with 1 day off per month, which is completely different from the articles and research up until this point. And then they further explain that there are mounting pressures at the job for workers for increased production because there's limited access to their families. So if they don't maintain that level of work, they could be fired with nowhere else to go. They work on commission, so most of their money they have to make a high amount of product in order to get a decent pay. And that production is very high and fast. So things are super efficient, and you basically have to try and keep up, especially if you're new, stuff like that. Now, these are kind of saying different things, and I am personally inclined to believe more of the NPR article just because it is focusing on a group of Chinese workers that were willing to tell their story, and it's not focused on one specific company or one industry like the PBS article. The NPR one, it also just correlates more with most of the research that I've done. And so overall, in breaking these down um, through migration, it's not really global, but Chinese workers are proactively choosing this and are using it for a means of social mobility to move from these rural suburban communities, move to the city, work in the factory, build that future for themselves. In terms of gender, both men and women can be seen working in these factories, with specific examples showing some domination of one gender over the other, which is very situation based. Like the hand stitching machines from home is mostly dominated by women, but this may be the different case in a home based method or a different factory in general. Labor wise, compared to other countries with a similar industry, China's factory workers are paid better. However, they do work the same amount with longer hours, but there is also increased factory upgrading, process upgrading, so they are able to be provided insurance, overtime, and then there is no child labor because of the process upgrading policy and regulations in place. And then some areas that I found kind of that can be seen as exploitative is when you're working from home, there are less regulations. When you're working in a center with select companies, if you're working in a center, same thing. And select companies can also be seen as exploiting their workers, but this doesn't necessarily define Chinese industry as a whole. And from what I've seen and researched, not the soccer manufacturing industry in China. And then here is my resources and research that I've done. Thank you so much.